Hello, and thanks for joining me here for another episode of Story Time. Today's story is from the collection, Peripheral Visions and Other Stories, and it's actually the title story, Peripheral Visions. And this story has a particular place in my heart, which I'll explain after I read the short excerpt. Peripheral Visions. Shoot. Lena caught sight of the sign pointing the way to the rest stop off I-77, almost a fraction of a moment too late. She turned the wheel too sharply, causing the right tires of her old Ford Escort to kick up bits of gravel from the shoulder before she could navigate it safely onto the turnoff. Shaking slightly, she slowed the car to a more sedate 25 miles per hour before brushing the perspiration from her forehead. That was close, she said to no one in particular. Talking to herself was a habit she had acquired since her mother's passing. The young think older people talk to themselves because they're going senile. But when there's no one left to talk to, you have to talk out loud. Otherwise, the silence can be deafening. And after decades as a practical nurse where she routinely carried on conversations with patients simply to ease the sterile loneliness of the oncology ward, Lena knew the value of the spoken word, even when there wasn't anyone around to answer. She glanced up at her rearview mirror, hoping the blue highway patrol car that seemed to be shadowing her since she had crossed into West Virginia hadn't caught her latest misjudgment. That's all she would need. Flashing lights, a request that she show her driver's license, and then a trip to the police station where they would no doubt confiscate her car and contact her niece, Claire. Claire. By now, Claire might have figured out what Lena was up to, but she still wouldn't be exactly sure where her aunt had headed. For who would expect a 72-year-old woman who had never driven beyond the Kingsville city limits to drive the 900 plus miles from Ohio to Florida? Not Claire, that's for sure. Claire would have expected Lena to be looking forward to her move to Golden Glow, to behave as the sane, sensible, and highly responsible maiden aunt she had always been. Not this time, though, Lena said aloud, as she checked the parking area for other cars, including any with the telltale light bar mounted on the roof and distinctive twin gold stripes on the side, before pulling into a parking spot. For once in my life, I'm going to do what I want instead of walking a straight line right up to the end. That's the biggest problem with the world today, she thought, as she gingerly slid out of the car, carefully stretching her back to work out the kinks. The pain that had plagued her shoulder was even worse than usual this morning, undoubtedly aggravated by too many hours behind the wheel. She moved her body slowly, continuing her conversation aloud. People walk around with blinders on just like horses, their eyes glued on the goal, the big picture. There's no sidestepping, no walking off the beaten path, no road less traveled. You get ahead that way, it's true. But what if where you end up isn't where you should have gone? Okay, that is the excerpt from Peripheral Visions, which, as I said, is from the collection titled the same. And a little bit about the backstory and why this story in particular is so special to me. I had written this story years ago. Yeah, I do have a habit of writing stories, and then even though I know they need some editing, just kind of parking them on my computer hard drive, or years ago when I typed them, putting them in a folder until I'm ready to really dive into them and do the fine tuning. In this particular case, the problem with the story, which is the character making the long journey from Ohio down to Florida, St. Augustine in particular. In this particular case, to get the details exactly right, I would have to make the journey. And for a multitude of various reasons, between work and caregiving and just other reasons, never was able to make the trip. So the story sat there. I mean, it was pretty much finished but you needed to put the specific facts in there. I mean, if you're going to say that the character stopped at a rest stop, for example, an hour after she crossed into West Virginia on a specific highway, you better make darn sure that there is a rest stop an hour on that highway after crossing into West Virginia. Anyways, so in the fall of 2015, around the beginning of November 5th, actually, my father had passed away. He'd been living with me for the last few years, and he had passed away. My mother had died 10 years earlier, and it was a difficult time for me, needless to say. And you know, you're doing all the closing up the estate things, finishing out the paperwork things, dealing with the grief things, you know how it goes. And on top of it all, trying to work because I'm a full-time writer. And I got it into my head in January that maybe this is a good time for me to try this trip. I mean, it was a crazy idea. I personally had never done a drive of that length by myself. When my dad was with me, we might drive to Indiana, we might drive to Massachusetts, but there was 2 of us in the car. It wasn't just me. And so this would be a big deal for me. I mean, I've flown all over the country, but I've never made a drive by myself. So tried to talk some of my girlfriends into going with me. Nobody was available. And so it became, all right, you can do this. And I did the drive, and it actually was a pretty easy drive. It only took me 2 days, and I made a lot of stops because I had to make a lot of notes. But the important thing is, during the drive, it gave me the opportunity to really process all the emotions about my father's loss. And of course, remembering the loss of my mother and just thinking about life in general. And I think in some ways I was kind of channeling Lena, the character, the main character in the story, because, you know, no matter how old you are, when you lose your parents, you still somewhat feel bereft, like an abandoned child. You're an orphan now. And it gave me the opportunity to sort of channel Lena and what she was dealing with, and think about the next stage of my life, because I was at a point, you know, my kids are grown, my grandchild's grown, and realizing with my father's passing, there was nobody who actually needed me to provide immediate care, to be the point person. Okay, everybody was pretty much independent. So really looking at a different stage in my life. And this was something I had to come to terms with. You know, that is what life is all about. Life is all about change. And looking to see, where do I want to go next? And is there perhaps something that's calling to me in my particular peripheral vision? So that is the backstory about Peripheral Visions, and I hope the brief excerpt that I read is intriguing enough that you will want to read the whole story and find out what happens. Does Lena make it down to Florida? Does she end up living alone? Is she happy where she ends up? Is it what she expected? And I do look forward to meeting with you again when I will read you another excerpt from my stories. Thanks so much.